Hello, and welcome to the James Bond Countdown, the series where I, a lifelong 007 fan, bring you ranked lists pertaining to every last aspect of the James Bond film franchise. Before I dive into my next list, I want to quickly give a huge thank you to everyone who tuned in for my first list and subscribed to the channel. I was and continue to be absolutely overwhelmed and humbled by the response, and it makes me wish that I could make this my full-time job, or at least a full-time hobby. So thank you, and I sincerely hope that you enjoy the many lists to come. Now, I think it's safe to say that most Bond fans have their own rankings for all of the obvious stuff, like cars, gadgets, ladies, villains, and the films themselves, and I'll definitely rank each of those elements as well, but I also want to mix in lists about things that most fans might not even think to rank, the first of which being all of the film titles. And I mean that as literally as possible. I'm talking about each title as a standalone word or phrase without any context whatsoever. This is something we only think about when they're announcing the title of a new film, but I'm going to try doing it with the whole series by ignoring all the details of the movies themselves and just thinking about how I like the sound of each title. Hopefully you all enjoy, but first I just want to remind everyone that everything is subjective and these are just my personal opinions, so please comment respectfully. Alright, this is a complete countdown. Octopussy is one of 3 titles that sound like dirty jokes to me, and in this instance, I'm aware that's intentional to a degree, because Fleming was famous for his risque double entendres, but that doesn't mean that it works for me personally. I think Bond fans are really used to hearing it, so we are typically unfazed by it, but for anyone else, it is impossible to take this title seriously. It doesn't sound cool, mysterious, dangerous, or exciting in any way. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a really mixed bag of a title for me. I love the Secret Service part, it's so evocative of a world filled with espionage and high adventure, but the Her Majesty part just makes me think of the royal family, for obvious reasons, and they are anything but exciting in my mind. Ultimately though, the combination of these 2 phrases makes for a title that's really just too wordy for its own good. Speaking of being too wordy, The Man with the Golden Gun suffers from the same problem in my opinion. After all, it is the longest title of any Bond movie to date, but beyond the length, it's just kind of a hard title to conceptualize. Remember, I'm trying to judge these titles as if I have no knowledge of the movies themselves, and with that in mind, one is left to wonder, who is the Man with the Golden Gun? Is it figurative, referring to Bond as an excellent shot, or is it literal, referring to a new character? In which case, is a man with a golden gun supposed to sound intimidating? Because honestly, it's kind of silly to try picturing a golden gun. It's not a very inconspicuous weapon. Similar to Man with a Golden Gun, Dr. No is another title that's sort of hurt by its own ambiguity. Is this a doctor who's literally named No? Is it a doctor who only says the word no? Or a doctor who only gives bad news? Like Dr. Oh No, like a nickname? Whatever the case may be, it's not someone who sounds particularly threatening. Maybe you could make a case for it sounding mysterious, but I would argue that without knowing the mystery surrounding the character in the story, the title itself is more confusing than it is mysterious. As you might have guessed, Goldfinger is another title that sounds like a dirty joke to me. Going in blind, I don't think anyone would guess that it's a character's name, let alone the villain. It's another one of those titles that would likely have someone asking, what is a Goldfinger? Is it a literal finger made out of gold, like some kind of MacGuffin? Is it an action, like to give someone a gold finger, hence the aforementioned dirty joke? It's just such a difficult word to conceptualize as a title. I can distinctly remember when the title for Skyfall was first announced, and I distinctly remember thinking that it sounded kinda awkward, honestly. And I don't entirely know why, but for whatever reason it just sounded clunky to me. Not bad, but not necessarily Bondian either. I think 10 years later it's come to sound very natural, but when I first said it out loud I didn't think it had much of a ring to it. Maybe part of it was that it had been so long since we'd had a one-word title, and this was certainly the most abstract one-word title we'd ever had. I wish I could give a more educated analysis on this one, but I really can't think of any way to explain it other than it's just kind of a weird word. Speaking of weird words, I would say that Moonraker also falls under that category. I know it's probably unfair of me to think about these titles so literally, but I can't help myself from picturing a landscaper raking the surface of the moon. And I think it's definitely the raker part that hurts this one. A title with the word moon has the potential to sound mysterious, but the harsh rake sound sort of kills that silky mystique. As you might have guessed, Thunderball is the third of those dirty joke titles I mentioned. Definitely the least so, but still. However, setting aside the ball of it all, I love the use of the word thunder in a Bond title. It's a word that promises thrills on a massive scale. And overall, I do think that Thunderball as a title is effective at getting you excited about what kind of danger it might be referring to. You've just got to get past the instinctual adolescent reaction to it first. A lot has been said about the title License to Kill. Timothy Dalton in particular never misses an opportunity to express his preference for the original title, License Revoked. I guess I fall somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, I can understand why someone might feel that it maybe sounds too simplistic. I mean, what's next? A film titled Walther PPK? But on the other hand, I think this is a title that really appeals to American audiences in particular, especially compared to License Revoked, which is of course why it was changed after all. It's a title very akin to American action movies of the 1980s. Titles like Lethal Weapon, First Blood, Raw Deal, and of course Die Hard. Which is fitting because License to Kill in many ways feels very similar to those Joel Silver-produced 80s action outings. I guess when I hear License Revoked, I think, ooh, they took my license away. So scary. Now I'll have to wait in line at the DMV to renew it. But when I hear License to Kill, I think, yeah, badass. And I feel like that represents the general American attitude towards the title. That being said, I do genuinely think that kill and die are always great buzzwords for a Bond title. They instantly promise danger. For me, No Time to Die is a title with a very elusive energy. It almost sounds like a Fleming title, but not quite, and it does feel Bondian, but not in an obvious way. When I first saw it, it didn't immediately hit me as a strong Bond title, but the more I looked at it and thought about it, the more I liked it. And I can't explain why, but I think the thing that makes this title feel not quite classic is the word time. It's not exactly a word that I think anyone would have expected to hear in a Bond title, just because it's more of a contextual word than a thematic one. But that being said, it doesn't sound bad at all. Overall, I find this title to be mysteriously thought-provoking in a way that feels urgent and fateful. More often than not, I have heard Quantum of Solace cited not only as a bad title, but as the worst title of the whole franchise, and I've never understood why. I think it has a great sound to it. Quantum and Solace are both words that have an inherent air of mystery and intrigue about them, and as a phrase it sounds meaningful, even if it's not clear what that meaning is just from the title itself, which I actually remember being the biggest complaint at the time it was announced. Everyone wanted to know what it meant, and somehow it was a bad thing that it wasn't obvious. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I want a mystery box title every time, but once in a while it is nice to get a title that's a little deeper than something about killing or dying. Tomorrow Never Dies is one of a couple titles that almost sounds like a parody of a Bond title, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't a good legitimate Bond title. If anything, it means that it sounds exactly how a Bond title should sound, and that's impressive because this was the first truly original Bond film title that was not pulled from Ian Fleming in any way. License to Kill and GoldenEye were not Fleming titles, but they were pulled from and inspired by Fleming. Tomorrow Never Dies just has a timeless, sexy sound to it, and it's not a title that you would ever try to interpret literally. It's obviously an idiom that serves to evoke a thematic tone rather than express a contextual meaning. It makes you think about the way that James Bond lives, how each day is a new adventure, and you never know what'll happen next, but you do know that anything is possible in the world of 007. There aren't many Bond titles that touch on the romanticism of the franchise, and the spy genre as a whole for that matter, but The Spy Who Loved Me is one of the few that does. It has the sound of an old studio picture from the golden age of Hollywood, something that would star Cary Grant or Humphrey Bogart, directed by Alfred Hitchcock or Billy Wilder. It's a title that paints pictures of smoky casinos and exotic locations full of femme fatales, and it just flows beautifully. The Spy Who Loved Me. Classic. For Your Eyes Only is a title that strikes a strong balance between romanticism and intrigue. It's easy to associate it with files marked classified and top secret, promising old-school spy work, but just as easy to associate it with the tantalizing whispers of a seductive beauty, promising romantic escapism. Either one of these things would make it a strong Bond title, but the combination of the two makes it one of the strongest Bond titles ever. The Living Daylights is a very bold, dramatic, theatrical title. It's a very old English idiom that simply refers to a person's vital senses, but as a title it sounds dangerous and exhilarating. James Bond is a character who's always living on the edge. He has to stay sharp if he wants to stay alive. And I feel like this title is a powerful representation of that idea. It's a phrase that feels authentically Bondian even though it predates Bond by a couple centuries. Along with Tomorrow Never Dies, I think Die Another Day is the other title that almost sounds like a Bond spoof, but again I don't think that keeps it from being a proper Bond title in its own right. And again I'll reiterate the same positives I mentioned for Tomorrow Never Dies. It's got a timeless sound that makes a thematic statement and leaves you thinking about the excitement of a Bond film. The idea of this man who's constantly thrust into desperate situations but always finds a way out in some thrilling escape. And I also think there's something to be said for its simplicity. It's easy to overthink a Bond title, but Die Another Day keeps it simple in the most satisfying ways possible. In short, it sounds authentically Bondian, and it's got a great ring to it. Enough said. Ironically, Spectre might be a title that actually works better when you remove the context of it. I think the context hurts it because it brings the weight of expectations given the organization's significance in the series. But try your best to forget the history of Spectre and Bond lore, and just judge it as a word. Naturally, the first thing that comes to mind is a ghost, a spook, a spy. It sounds mysterious, seductive, and just plain cool. It's a perfect fit for the spy genre, evoking the cloak and dagger elements of old-school espionage. GoldenEye may as well be the Fleming title that never was. It was, of course, a contingency operation that he devised during the war, and subsequently the name of his Jamaican home, but surprisingly he never used it as a Bond title. Regardless, it certainly has all the hallmarks of a Bond title. Gold is always a Bond buzzword, and combining it with I gives the title a really slick sound. I just has a more cool, cryptic sound to it than Finger, for example. It inherently sounds like a code name, which means it's not in danger of being taken too literally when you try to conceptualize it. This is a title that screams spy work, and it oozes authenticity from a Bondian perspective. In my opinion, The World Is Not Enough is by far the strongest of the longer, wordier titles. It has a dramatic, fateful sound to it that teases a story with an epic scale. It really plays into the tradition of James Bond taking on a global threat. One can't help but think of all the iconic villains from the classic Bond era. The mustache-twirling, monologuing maniacs scheming either to take over the world or to destroy it. I hear this title and immediately picture Bond racing to stop a ticking time bomb, or exploring the caverns of a massive underground lair. It's just another one of those titles with an undeniably timeless sound. I've always thought that A View to a Kill is just a badass title through and through. The original Fleming title was From A View to a Kill, and I'm glad they dropped the from because it just flows so much better and packs much more of a punch. Kill is of course one of those quintessential Bond buzzwords, and for some reason View just has something elusively sexy about it. To that effect, this title almost has a Hitchcockian Dial M for Murder kind of sound to it. It immediately makes me think I'm in for an espionage thriller brimming with suspense. It promises murder, intrigue, and sensual rendezvous with double-crossing femme fatales. It has a very old Hollywood film noir vibe, and I'm all about it. Some might find it surprising that I would rank Diamonds Are Forever this highly, and if I'm being honest, it surprised me too. But I just love this title. It has a timeless mystique and sensuality that feels right at home in the world of James Bond. Diamonds hits that same sweet spot as Gold, and Forever again brings that fateful theatricality to the title. And that equal balance of the romantic and the dramatic gives this title an old-fashioned flair that feels authentically Bondian. Beyond that, it just sounds great to say. Diamonds Are Forever. Casino Royale is perhaps the quintessential Bond title, not just because it was the first novel, but because casinos are such an indelible part of Bond history. They're probably featured more frequently than any other location across both the books and the films. We immediately associate them with everything sexy and dangerous about the world of James Bond. The moment he walks into one, you know there's a 50-50 chance he'll cross paths with a lover or a killer. And then there's Royale, which carries a classic sense of intrigue. Put the two together and you've got one strong-sounding title that immediately gets the blood pumping. From Russia with Love is another one of those few titles that taps into the romanticism of the franchise, but it also teases the intrigue of international espionage. Now, without an awareness of the Cold War, the title probably wouldn't have that same impact, but I'm only ignoring the context of the movie, not world history. With that in mind, Russia is obviously remembered as the big bad of the Cold War, so featuring it this prominently in a Bond title inherently promises a true spy thriller. Then you have With Love, which undoubtedly promises the romantic side of spy work, at least fictional spy work. The combination of the two makes for an enduring phrase that's not only a staple of Bond history, but probably one of the most famous titles of all time. My top two titles are really neck and neck. They're both just so perfect in every conceivable way. And as you can see, one of those aforementioned titles is none other than You Only Live Twice. This title started the tradition of Bondian idioms, and it's thought-provoking in all the best ways. It's mysterious without being confusing, cheeky without being campy, and epic without being abstract. You know this title means something, and you can't wait to find out what, because with a title this cool, you know you're in for lots of danger and thrills on a massive, globe-trotting scale. As far as I'm concerned, You Only Live Twice set the standard for great Bond titles. Well, if you've been following along, you probably figured out that my all-time favorite Bond title is Live and Let Die. The exact opposite of how I described my least favorite title. This one sounds cool, mysterious, dangerous, and exciting in every way. The inclusion of die, of course, delivers one of those quintessential Bond buzzwords, and the overall phrase perfectly encapsulates how James Bond lives, how he has to live to stay alive himself. He can't afford to give people the benefit of the doubt in his line of work. If he puts his trust in the wrong person, he might not live to regret it. I can think of no better sentiment to represent a cold-blooded killer who always lives life on the edge. Beyond that, it just sounds badass. You can't help but feel like you're in for an action-packed thrill ride full of exotic locales, nefarious villains, and seductive beauties. You know, exactly how you want to feel going into a James Bond movie. Well, there you have it, my complete countdown ranking every film title from the official Bond series. In the process of making this particular list, I really came to realize that judging the titles out of context is sort of like taking a Rorschach test. So please jump down into the comments and let me know what comes to your mind when you hear these titles. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss a countdown.